Hi everyone, I am once again returning to show you what I knit in a year. We'll talk a little bit more about this channel and what my plans are and why I changed the name at the end of the video. So if you're just interested in looking at a bunch of knitted items, we're gonna start with that. This is my stack this year. It's a bit smaller than last year. In total, I finished 13 projects, 4 sweaters, 4 pairs of socks, 3 hats, and 2 pairs of mitts. Out of the 13, 3 of them were Christmas gifts that I don't have, so I'll show you some quick photos of those. But we're gonna talk about the other 10, most of which I knit for myself. But we're not gonna get into all of the stats of my knitting in this video. I'm going to make another video where I talk about my stats for 2023 and also my 2024 knitting goals. I don't have a ton, but I do have a few things that I want to do in this upcoming year that I'm really excited about. We're going to start off talking about sweaters because that is forever my favorite thing to knit. And I will show you first a sweater that I've talked about on this channel before. I was working on this over the summer. This is the Ilha by Orlane Sucche. This is a fingering weight top-down circular yoke sweater with raglan shaping. It's got a lot of interesting details such as the cables and the eyelets in the yoke. It's got cables running down the sides of the sweater, and it's also got this really interesting syncopated twisted 1x1 ribbing that I hadn't seen before in any other patterns. It's one of the things that really drew me to this pattern in particular. It's also got a rolled neckline, so you just leave it stockinette and you basically don't do anything to it. And it also has like slight bishop sleeves. It's a very relaxed style, so it's not as big of a sleeve as the sweater I'm wearing today, which is the Be Thankful cardigan by Lily Kate Makes. But it's just a nice, like, relaxed, easy to wear sleeve that again was like another thing that drew me to this sweater. I just think all of the details really work together well to create a nice, cohesive, beautiful sweater. The gauge is knit at a bit of a looser gauge for fingering weight yarn. It's knit at a gauge of 5 1/4 stitches per inch, whereas normally fingering weight sweaters would typically be knit between like 6 to 7 stitches per inch. The loose gauge just gives it a bit of a romantic vibe, and the yarn that I chose, Cloudborn fibers in their Highland fingering, which is unfortunately discontinued, but it's a woolen spun, so it really like blends the cables and the lace into the yoke. The fit on this sweater is really nice. As I mentioned, it's a circular yoke, but about halfway down the yoke it's got raglan shaping, which really helps to separate the sleeves from the body. If you've ever knit a circular yoke sweater, especially a colorwork sweater where the colorwork extends down the entire yoke, sometimes those yokes can be fairly deep, and so the separation of the sleeve and the body happens really low, which causes your arms to kind of be pulled toward your torso. This sweater does not have that issue at all. It's got full range of motion in the arms. So if you have had that issue in the past, I can recommend trying a sweater with sort of like a hybrid between a circular yoke and raglan, because you get that beautiful round yoke that can really show off a stitch pattern well, but you also get a really nice fit, so it's kind of the best of both worlds. Alright, moving on to the next sweater. This is the Hanko by Sari Nordlund. It was my first Sari Nordlund pattern, and it's kind of funny because it's such a simple pattern and she's really known for like cables and other elaborate stitch patterns. But I saw this sweater and I was just really attracted to the simplicity of it and the wearability. I tend to go for more interesting sweaters to knit, but then I kind of feel like I can't just like wear those over and over again. So I really liked how simple this was, but it has these 2-color stripes that I think are really unique, and they were a lot of fun to knit as well. It is knit from the top down. It's a drop shoulder construction. It's got 1x1 rib throughout, a folded over neckline, It's got a 2-color tubular bind off at all of the hems, which I think was a really fun touch. And it's also got a pearl column running down the side of the sweater and the underside of the sleeves to avoid the jog that you would get with the stripes, which I thought, again, it was just like a small detail, but I liked doing that more than trying to do the jogless stripes, and you don't even notice that the pearl column's there while you're wearing the sweater. So I thought that was a really good method to avoid a jog. And it's got somewhat interesting sleeves as well. They are pretty relaxed. There's only a few decreases, and they're about 3/4 length or maybe bracelet length depending on how they end up fitting. I think mine ended up more of a 3/4 length, which I like and I dislike. I like the look of it. I like the fact that they're much more like square and more relaxed looking. I think that shape of sleeve really suits the length well. But the reason I dislike them is I just tend to get a little cold. I used Webb's yarn for this. Their Valley Yarns Northfield in the colorway Natural, and their Valley Yarns Hampden in the colorways Evergreen and Lizard for the stripes. And I'm pretty happy with the yarn. It's very soft. I think the Northfield, the main color, has a little bit of cashmere in it. So it's just like ever so slightly fuzzy. It's got a little bit of a halo that I think it looks nice. It's a little bit more high end. We'll see how it wears. I only had a few chances, maybe like 3 or 4 times to wear it because I finished it pretty late in the year. But overall, I would say I'm pretty happy with it, and I really like how the 1x1 ribbing worked up in this yarn. I almost always knit my ribbing combination style because it removes the slack from your purl stitches, which then helps your knit stitches look tidier. And some yarns translate that better than other yarns, and I think it looks really nice in this yarn. The only, I guess, issue I have with it is it does that thing where one leg of the stitch is straight and the other leg sticks out like this. That has to do with the way that the yarn is spun, so there's really like nothing you can do as a knitter to counteract that. And it's also like not that big of a deal. I think it bothers some people and other people like don't even notice it. I am kind of somewhere in between. I noticed it while I was working on it, but like now that I wear it, I'm not I'm not like noticing that every time I put it on. The fit on this sweater is, I would say, decent. It's got a boxy, very relaxed style, so it's hard to go wrong there. But the shoulder shaping is interesting. It is one of the things that drew me into this pattern because I wanted to try it out. But I think now that I've tried it, I probably wouldn't go for this construction again. So you start out with short row shaping for the back neck, which I always love and I think should be in pretty much every sweater. And then you kind of rapidly increase on both sides of the shoulders. So you create this line of increases going down each shoulder. Because of this construction, I do notice that the neck like slightly pulls. I wouldn't describe it as like choking, like it's not that bad, but it just like kind of bothers me when I wear it. So I every now and then just kind of like pull it down a little bit. And I think that's probably just to do with how rapidly the increases are at the shoulder lines. It's just like a little bit of a tight fit. I knit the size 2, which is 43 3/4 inches at the bust. I actually originally cast on the smallest size because I have a 36-inch bust at my full bust. The pattern recommends 10 inches of positive ease, and I wanted to select a size that had closer to like 6 inches of ease at the full bust. But as I started working on the shoulders, I could just tell that like it was not going to fit. Thankfully, the cast on stitches are the same for the first 2 sizes, so I just sized up to the second size and increased enough for that size, and I'm really glad I did that. I think this is one of those sweaters where even if you wanted to go down in ease, you can't go down too much because I don't think the shoulders are going to fit. I don't know, I'm curious to know what other people think of this construction style and fit. I did take a look at projects on Ravelry. I didn't see anyone having an issue. I also wouldn't say that like I have an issue with it. Just like a slightly different fit than kind of your classic construction. So my size ended up having 8 inches of ease at the full bust and actually 11 inches of ease at the upper bust. And I tend to select my ease by upper bust instead of full bust because I have more than 2 inches. I think I have about 3 inches of difference there. So I like the fit better when I select by my upper bust. But it's kind of interesting that I ended up with about 11 inches of positive ease, and I think I'm pretty happy with that fit. Generally, I would say that's like too big for me, but I think with this sweater it works, and I am happy with the size I ended up choosing. Oh, one thing I wanted to mention is that I actually ran out of yarn for this sweater, which is part of the reason it took me like a really long time. I didn't finish it until like November, I think. That is partly okay, so it's because the Ravelry project page was actually incorrect on the yardage requirements. It was like maybe 100 to 150 yards less than what you actually needed. I guess that was kind of a lesson for me not to just rely on the pattern page, but to check the pattern as well. I think I ordered the yarn before I had like fully purchased the pattern and opened it up and everything, which I don't normally do. But anyway, I do take part responsibility for that because as I was ordering the yarn, I was like, this doesn't seem like enough yarn, and didn't really check that intuition and just ordered it anyway. And then as soon as I ran out of yarn, I was like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. It did kill my momentum just like slightly because the yarn was of course out of stock in the colorway that I needed. So I had to wait like 3 something months before I could order more, but it's all good and I'm really happy with the sweater. Moving on to the last 2 sweaters, which happen to be sweaters that I designed. I want to use that term very, very loosely because I am not a knitwear designer and I am not publishing these patterns, and I did not like fully write out a pattern in multiple sizes, like nothing like that. But these sweaters did not follow a pattern, so unfortunately you can't find them anywhere. I feel a little bit conflicted about sharing these types of items because I think it would be kind of disappointing to watch someone show off a sweater that they knit and then not be able to knit it. So I won't go into too much detail about them, but I do want to show them off. I am proud of them, and I also think that it kind of shows a journey that I've been on this year with knitting. I have really focused on learning how sweater construction works, learning what good fit means, learning how to implement various techniques to get a really good fit for my body specifically. And a big part of that was kind of creating my own sweaters from scratch and trying to, basically challenging myself to figure out how to create a sweater that fits me and that I'm happy with. So the first sweater I'll show you is what I call my Mango Improv sweater. And the reason I call it that is one day I was on the Female Fashion Advice subreddit and I saw someone posting or wearing a sweater from ASOS that is no longer available. And I was looking at it, I was really drawn to it. I thought it was cool and also like fairly simple. And I guess I just thought like I could make that. So I don't really have a problem with recreating commercial sweaters for personal use. And basically all I did was I found the sweater online. I found like an out of stock listing and found a few photos, looked at those, studied them a bit, and just kind of came up with my own recreation of that sweater. I was also very motivated by it because I was going through my yarn stash looking at mostly scraps and like leftover skeins, and I put together this combination of yarns just based on what I had. As soon as I realized that like I actually had a lot of the colors in stash, which doesn't usually happen to me, I got really excited about it. I did need to buy one of the colors, this like honey gold color, and I also needed to buy the fingering weight black yarn for the body of the sweater. So I chose Knitting for Olive Merino, which I had never worked with before. I think I mostly liked it. I think it's a good yarn, and they have like so many colors, so I'll probably end up working with it again. One thing I found is that it's pretty splitty, so I didn't love that, but I can get around that. So it is a top-down circular yoke sweater, which up until this point I had only knit one of the Ilha that you saw earlier. So I feel like I didn't exactly know what I was getting myself into, but I did a bunch of research on different types of circular yokes. I started with Elizabeth Zimmerman's percentage system and kind of went from there. I didn't end up using any sort of like base pattern or book or anything like that. I really just took the stitch count that I wanted for the opening of the neck and the stitch count that I wanted for the circumference of the bust, and kind of worked out the math from there using a spreadsheet. One of the decisions that I made that took me a really long time to actually just like figure out if that's what I wanted to do was to knit the yoke in vertical wedges. So there's kind of like two types of circular yokes. There's the one that's more of like a horizontal circular yoke, where you have rapid increase rounds maybe 3 or 4 times throughout the yoke, and those increases don't really interrupt the pattern. I guess you have to deal with them like 3 or 4 times to deal with that pattern shift, but otherwise you have like big chunks of vertical space where your stitch pattern is not interrupted. The other way to create a circular yoke is by having vertical wedges. And so you can kind of think of it as like each wedge of your yoke is a triangle. You design that stitch pattern within that triangle, and then you place those triangles side by side in a circle. I originally started out with the first method. I did a bunch of math, a bunch of swatching, and like cast on the yoke multiple times to try to figure out how to make that method work with my stitch pattern. The stitch pattern is very simple. It is just slipping a knit column every other round on a bed of reverse stockinette. And so it's really simple. It was easy to figure out from the photos, but I just could not figure it out with that method. So that's when I did some more research and found the other method, the vertical wedge, which is also common in color work. It's often found where the color work pattern is really small and it repeats. Anyway, it was really quite simple to figure it out from there. Again, I just used a spreadsheet to figure out the percentages and all of the stitch counts and knit the sweater. It has got a folded over neckband. I put short row shaping in the back without interrupting the stitch pattern, so it's got a pretty nice fit. It is just a circular yoke the entire way, but I don't feel like the yoke is too deep, so I think it ends up fitting pretty nicely. Another little detail that I'll mention is that the ribbing is a 1x2 ribbing where you slip the knit stitch every other round. And the sleeve shape is fairly standard. It's got a bit of a relaxed shape with a gradual taper. Okay, and this last sweater I really won't spend much time on because this was more of a process project for me rather than a project for the finished item. My boyfriend is doing some construction work today, so it's a little loud. I will try to talk in between the loud noises. There's always something going on every time I try to film. Okay, so this is what I have called my summer Cardi. I was inspired to work on this project because I picked up Nora Gaughan's The Twisted Stitch sourcebook from my library. and I was just browsing the stitch patterns. I had all these ideas for how I wanted it to fit. I had an idea for like what my use case was for it. I wanted to create a cropped, like really kind of small and tight fitting cardigan for the heat of the summer when I want to wear like tank top dresses to nicer restaurants, and I just want to throw like a little bit of a, you know, something on as it gets a little chillier throughout the night. So I do think I accomplished that goal, and I am very proud of what I created. I just don't think it's really my style, and I don't think I'll end up wearing it a whole lot, but I am proud of this sweater and I do want to talk about it. So the yarn was repurposed from an older sweater, like older top that I knit. So it's knit bottom up, it's knit flat. The sleeves are set in sleeve, knit top down in the round. I used the method in the book Top Down, Reimagining Set in Sleeve Design by Elizabeth Doherty, and it's an amazing technique. It's really simple to do. Yeah, I really just like loved everything about that process, and putting that into a sweater is so much fun. It was so satisfying, and it does fit like really well. I also put in like a mini shawl collar, which I think ended up working out really nice. I think it pairs with the stitch pattern on the fronts well, and overall just like fits the vibe that I was going for. I think that's everything I'm gonna say about this sweater. It really informed a lot for me and helped me learn a lot about knitting, but it's just not necessarily something that's like easy to talk about on a knitting podcast. Moving on to accessories, I finished the Anticline mitts by Emily Greene that I was working on in I think 2 videos ago. I started these in the spring. They took a really long time. These are like my most technical knit ever, I think, and just a very intensive process, but I love the finished object. They are just really cool. They're fully twisted rib with 1x1 cables to create this cool pattern down the front, and there's a bunch of details that really bring it all together, as is par for the course for Emily Greene patterns. The first one went really well. Surprisingly, the second one is when I started messing up the cable pattern. There's quite a lot of charts, or at least like long charts, for these mitts. It's again quite intense for an accessory pattern, but I think by the time I got to the second one, I was like not only a little bit over it, gonna be honest, you know, I was still excited about the FO, but it just was a lot. But I also kind of felt like I had the pattern down in my head, so I think I just kind of went off the chart a little bit and started reading my knitting and doing the next thing based off of what I was seeing in my knitting rather than reading the chart. And that's what threw me off. I ended up knitting like an entire section of a chart a second time when I didn't need to. So there was a lot of like frogging and re-knitting, and it got a little much there on the second one, but I powered through. I'm really happy I did. These used some leftover yarn that I had from knitting the Raina shawl by Andrea Mowry, which I did do a video on, but I don't recommend watching that video. I don't think it's any good. No mods, the pattern is perfect, loved it. Definitely recommend, but make sure you have like 2 months of uninterrupted, focused knitting time to work on these. The other Emily Greene pattern that I knit this year is Link. It's this cool cabled hat that's knit from the bottom up. There are 2 options, one without the folded brim and 1 size available. I used Kelbourne Woolens Lucky Tweed in the colorway light gray, which is a worsted weight. I used exactly 1 skein, but I did run into some issues. So from cast on to bind off, this hat took me over a year. I cast on January of 2022 and I bound off May of this year. Wait, actually June. I picked it back up in May, so I knit it in about a month. But I first cast this on to pattern, and I could already tell it was 1, huge, and 2, I was definitely going to run out of yarn. I knit it through the full brim and got started on the cables, and I just knew something was off, but by that point I had already cast on the tubular cast on like 4 separate times. I don't remember, I was just having some issues with it. So I'd already redone it so many times that I just put it away and was like, I'll figure it out at another time. So that's what I did. I had a weekend trip for work and I needed a small project. I frogged what I had knit. I recast on with 12 fewer stitches and knit 2 patterns. So I lost the cool ribbing to cable transition, but because I chose to knit the folded brim option, it hides it anyway, so that doesn't really matter. The second time around, things are going better with the smaller brim, but I got to the crown shaping and I could tell again that I was going to run out of yarn. Most of this is to do with my gauge. Like, this is a hat I did not gauge swatch, and I did not like care too much about what my gauge was while I was knitting. Especially with small projects, I just tend to be like pretty spontaneous and experimental, and I'm just like blindly confident. I'm just like, I'll figure it out if it's wrong, and that's what I did. So I was actually on a road trip, a different trip, because I didn't finish it on the first trip. This is quite a like intense cabled hat, and with all the fit issues, it took me, you know, much longer than it needed to. But what I ended up doing was cutting into the cuff. So at the base of the cables, I put a needle through to capture all the stitches. I cut into it, I frogged the brim, and I re-knit it with 2 needle sizes smaller and using combination knitting to tighten up those purl stitches. Then I grafted on the new brim, and I don't think you can tell, I think I did a pretty decent job at that. And I bound off using the tubular bind off, but since this is 2x2 ribbing, I had to rearrange the stitches for a 1x1 tubular bind off, which I think looks a little bit worse than the 2x2 tubular cast on, but it's fine. It's a hat, it's done. I wear it a lot, I really like it. And I used up like every single inch of the yarn, so I had just enough. My biggest takeaway from this project is to use combination knitting when knitting ribbing and when knitting cables. Especially when I'm knitting an Emily Greene pattern. I have seen her talk about how she always knits in combination when she's knitting ribbing and cables, and I have had trouble achieving her gauge in those stitch patterns before. I did check my gauge a few times throughout the project, but I just like, it wasn't quite off enough to know for sure if I was going to run out of yarn. I do still think that reducing the cast on stitches was the right move, because I think this hat still would have been too big with the original stitch count. And then I also wanted to put it on because I feel like off of my head it looks huge, and I think it does end up fitting quite well. It's just not like a super tight hat, but it does fit. The other hat I knit this year is the Roku by Olgajazzy. This is a classic hat pattern. I've knit it many times before. I've had it for years. I used a DK weight instead of a worsted weight because I had this single like souvenir skein that I wanted to use up. It's one of those like LYS-specific yarns that they only had like a few skeins, and it wasn't even like fully labeled, so I can't really tell you what it is, but it's a really nice color. I just knit this for myself, and this was sort of another like really quick project. I cast it on when we were going on a hike. I didn't end up knitting it on the hike, but I knit it while we were driving up there and back, and pretty much finished it on that trip. I finished 2 pairs of socks for myself this year, including this pair of vanilla socks. I cast these on at the very beginning of the year to go along with a pair that I made my boyfriend for Christmas. This is another skein of souvenir yarn we picked up traveling together, and the contrasting yarn is what I used to knit his socks. And so I just use that for the heels and toes in my socks. The yarn is Hadlock Girls yarn, Queensbury, and Sparkle Sock in the colorways Christmas Morning and Hometown Christmas. These are just my go-to vanilla socks, cuff down, 60 stitches, knit on US 0, heel flap and gusset with a rounded wedge toe. And then for the cuffs, I decided to do honeycomb cables in between the 2x2 ribbing. The reason I decided to do that is because at the time I was knitting the Tuku honey socks, which is a pattern by Andrea Mallory that I will never knit again. I cast these on again at the start of a trip. I needed something a little bit engaging but still simple, and I thought this pattern would be perfect. I mean, honestly, like, it wasn't too bad, but just like by the end I was so done purling socks. I don't really mind purling that much, I think, compared to like a lot of knitters, so I thought this was gonna be fine. But wow, I would not make these socks unless you like prefer purling over knitting, because they are not knit inside out and you just have to purl the entire socks. By the end I was so done, and in fact on the second sock I messed up the heel, and there's definitely too much fabric here. I don't even care. I had redone the heel already, and by the time I realized that I messed it up and like just didn't decrease enough stitches here in the gusset, I was already like up to here, and I was just like, whatever. I mean, they turned out nice. I really like the honeycomb cables. The garter stitch panel is cool. Like, I guess if I were to knit them again, I would probably just knit the rest of the sock instead of purling it. Like, there's just kind of no reason to have gone to that level of effort for this like pair of socks in this non-superwash yarn that I'm a little bit concerned about is not going to hold up. It's another Cloudborn Fibers yarn that's discontinued, and I mean, I love the color. I like the socks. I just like, holy shit, would not purl socks again. I knit 3 gifts this year. 2 of them were pairs of DK weight socks using Fleegel's toe up sock pattern, which is a free pattern using the Fleegel heel. And then the 3rd gift I knit was just a simple 2x2 ribbed beanie, actually using a pattern called 2x2 that I just found for free on Ravelry. And the very last project that I bound off for 2023 is a gift for my boyfriend. They were supposed to be a Christmas gift, but I finished them on December 31st, right down to the wire. These are the Rodden mitts by Isolde Teague. I originally cast on a free pattern from Pearl Soho. I hated how they turned out, so I found this pattern by Isolde and figured can't really go wrong. I used Plymouth Yarns Mojito Merino in colorways that he picked out. The actual gift was a surprise, but he did pick the colors out. The only modifications I made is I enclosed the thumb because he requested that, and then I also added some elastic thread to the very bottoms of the cuffs just to cinch that in a little bit more to keep out the cold. That is everything I knit in 2023. My stack of knits ended up being a little bit shorter than previous years, but I think my stacks in other categories of life were larger this year. So that's just sometimes how it works out. I ended up spending a lot of time doing other things this year. But I am really excited for 2024. I feel like some things in my life have kind of calmed down to a point where I can focus a bit more on my hobbies. And part of that includes filming more and documenting what I'm making. I took about a 3-year break from Instagram. I was posting somewhat sporadically a few times throughout that time. Of course, I posted like a few videos, but I just wasn't consistent. I kind of felt like I had just enough time to knit and not any time more. So carving out the time and the mental energy and space to show you what I was working on was just kind of at the bottom of my priority list. I don't want to jinx anything, but I would really love to post here more regularly and kind of build up a community. I know it's hard to follow like really small people on social media when they don't have an upload schedule. They post really irregularly and you kind of don't know what to expect from them. I don't really have a brand on social media, and I don't plan to have a brand on social media. I just want to share what I knit. And that was kind of the motivation behind the channel name change and also the name change on Instagram. Previously, I was More Knits. I think that name just kind of felt stale to me. I'd used it for so long online, and I think my presence online has changed a lot over the years. I mean, I've changed a lot over the years, so I think the name change kind of reflects a new phase for me in my online presence, but also like in my personal knitting life. I have been knitting for most of my life. There's been a lot of trial and error in figuring out what I like to knit, what I like to wear. My personal style has changed a lot. My knowledge of knitting has grown a lot. It's really like not that deep, but I did just want to touch on it because I think it can be kind of confusing when people just like change things online and then never address it, and then you're like, what is happening? With all that being said, the next video that you can expect from me will be my 2023 knitting stats and my 2024 knitting goals. So I will see you then.